Welcome to the latest episode of Risk Engineers Talk Governance. In this episode, due diligence engineers Richard Robinson and Gaye Francis talk about project governance and due diligence. They discuss how they have applied a military approach to their work and also how they focus on critical success outcomes. Enjoy the episode. Please give us a rating if you enjoy our work, and also ensure that you subscribe on your favourite platform.
Hi Richard, welcome to another podcast session.
We're here again, Gaye.
We are. Today we're going to talk about project due diligence, which is, I guess, close to our heart. And I did a recent conference and attended a recent conference and presented a paper at Risk 2023, which was in Brisbane in September 2023. And the theme of the conference was Risk Engineering for a Resilient 2030. I think one of the key takeaways for me from the conference was a really interesting conference, and there was lots of papers given and everything, but there was a real focus, especially from the keynote speakers, around top-down criticality and vulnerability. And the people that were speaking as those keynotes were probably people that were putting projects together, so bigger projects, for example, the cladding replacement in Melbourne. That was one of the guys that spoke. But when you went and talked to people and the participants in the conference, one of the things that was still happening was those rare showstoppers were still bringing projects undone. You know, those things that were critical and rare. And I guess my presentation was all around project governance and the little booklet that we've got out, which is how to demonstrate due diligence and a practical guide for directors. And it really is that top-down focusing on the critical things, project showstoppers.
High consequence, low likelihood.
Yeah. And we've used this process for very many years on projects that have ranged from, am I going to get this right, 500 million to $2.5 billion.
I think we started about 10 million and up to 2.5, 3 billion.
There you go.
Australian dollars. I think Marine Coast Express was about 2.5 billion US, as I recall.
And I guess if we just talk through today about, you know, what makes our process that little bit different from the traditional processes that we've seen. And we've said in many of our podcasts that there's a whole lot of tools and techniques out there, and they provide you with different insights into the risk issues that you do, and some of the safety stuff that we've focused on safety in some of these podcasts, but the tools and techniques really do apply to projects as well, or can apply to projects as well.
Yep, mostly.
So again, we use, I guess, Richard, do you want to outline the process?
Well, so far as we're concerned, it's really a military intelligence process, and it was originally developed to deal with people going on missions. So if you get it wrong, you're all going to die. So it's actually worth getting it right. And what you don't do is take on a course of action where there's a critical showstopper that can come and bite you, even if it's rare. You just don't do it. And so we just adapted that. Now, part of the reason why I adapted it, I got it off Bob Browning, who used to be the people who used to work with us. Fortunately, he's no longer with us. And he used to be the head of protected services for Asia. He said he got it off MI6 because he was working there for 3 years with the English for a while. And when he came back to Australia and I was working with him, he just explained how it works and what it was, and we just kind of adapted it. But basically, it sort of says, well, the simplest way to describe it is to compare it to the way most people do project risk management now. And that is, what they do is they get people who have suffered pain in similar projects together in a room, and they try to express their pain, usually by adapting a risk register from the previous nearest project they've been able to find. And you can normally tell that's the case because somebody has failed to do a global search in the spreadsheet and the name of the past project still buried in there. And then they all pour the pain they've previously suffered on their similar projects and augment this risk register.
So we're talking about hundreds of items in a risk register, which is just unmanageable.
Yeah, and they do this usually around the tender stage. And as the project goes through, every now and then they drag this thing out and try to make sure they haven't overlooked something. And by the time they get to practical completion, they say, well, that's the end of the risk management process of practical completion. And then they hand it over to the poor site who's got to live with the result, who then has to spend a fair amount of time fixing it all up and making sure that it really does achieve the outcomes that everybody intended. The other way to do it, which is the way we've always done it, and this is what the military intelligence people do, is you actually walk forward in time to the end of the project when it's in and working and it's kicking all the goals you really want it to kick. We call them critical success outcomes. And you get the senior decision makers to explain what those essential critical success outcomes are. And then having established what this happy place is when it's in and functioning, not just practical completion, it's actually achieving all the things it's supposed to do when it's actually working. This is a happy place, by the way. This is where promotions are possible, excellence awards abound, and even bonuses can sometimes be represented. But this future happy place, and then you step backwards from that happy place and say, what are the threats to those outcomes? Those threats create vulnerabilities to those critical success outcomes. They are the vulnerabilities. And if you eliminate all those vulnerabilities, and these will be the high consequence, low likelihood ones as a rule, then you always wind up at this happy place on time, on budget, to spec. And it's clean and simple.
I think you said a couple of important things there, and I just want to touch on those. And that was really about that you're focusing on the vulnerabilities. We've seen a lot of projects focus on threats that don't necessarily affect a critical success outcome.
Correct. And that was one of Bob's special points. He kept hammering.
So the key is to focus on the vulnerabilities rather than the threats per se. Because if it doesn't affect one of your critical success outcomes, you don't want to spend resources and time on that particular threat.
Correct.
So you're focusing on the vulnerabilities, and they are the threats that affect your critical success outcomes. The second thing is about stakeholders and making sure the right stakeholders. Now, we've seen large projects and there are a number of interested parties that are very vocal.
And have opinions.
And have opinions that are often very loud, but they are not necessarily the key stakeholders for the project. So it's really important to make sure that you've identified the key stakeholders.
And what you mean by that are those who live or die by the success or otherwise of this project.
And I think sometimes that's the difficulty around this project governance and project due diligence stuff, is that there's a number of stages in a project, and unless you can get all of the key stakeholders involved in the project very, very early on, then there's often a mismatch of what the critical success outcomes are for the project.
Well, it's like the tram project. We did Gaye did the project due diligence for the procurement of the Class E trams, the first tranche of the Class E trams in Melbourne. And the real problem we had was getting Yarra trams on board, as I recall.
At the design stage.
At the design stage, because until you actually chosen what who the tenderer was and all that sort of stuff. But obviously the people who have to sign off with the safety case is the tram operator. In that case, it's Yarra Tram. So whilst there's a tendency for them not to be involved at the start, if they're the people who have to live with the final result and actually get the credited safety case up, if they're not involved in the initial design stages, you get something which is quite peculiar.
So it's almost critical that they're involved, and we've seen this with other projects as well, that you really do need to get the ultimate operators and maintainers on board very early on, because it's a lot easier to make changes at a design phase or at a design stage than it is to be delivered with a piece of infrastructure or vehicle, and then it had to be modified once it's been built.
Correct.
A lot cheaper as well.
Well, if your project will blow out, if you're talking about a 5-year project and you only discover at the end of year 4 that you've got a basic design flaw, you won't fix that. You're over time and over budget no matter what happens.
And you're looking for workarounds to deal with that particular issue.
And we've seen that happen a fair bit. We shouldn't mention any rail projects about which we're familiar, for example.
One of the interesting other things that I guess and there's been a couple of high-profile projects in the news lately, and one of them is the airport rail link for Victoria out to Melbourne Airport, and the project due diligence around that. And we understand that the federal government's just committed to providing half the funding for that particular project and to go ahead. And now there's some discussions with the airport around what that project looks like. Apparently they want all underground, and the offer on the table is above ground solution. But working towards that, you need all of the stakeholders involved. And look, don't get us wrong, we've worked on projects and they have gone relatively smoothly, but doesn't mean that doing this process doesn't mean that issues won't arise.
Correct.
What it does typically mean is if you correctly identified your critical success outcomes and your threats and your key vulnerabilities, credible critical vulnerabilities, those project showstoppers, typically you don't get surprises.
That's right. You know there's a problem and you know how hard it is and you can make a decision about it. But I don't think we've ever had a surprise in any major project we've dealt with.
No. We've had to refine some controls.
Correct.
Before and tighten up those when they did manifest itself, and often that's in terms of quality assurance systems. But it's relatively straightforward, as Richard said. Make sure you got your key stakeholders in the room. Make sure you critical success outcomes are clearly articulated. That's where we've also seen projects come undone where the ultimate owner has been unable to clearly articulate what they're trying.
You're better off not proceeding with the project if the ultimate owner can't articulate what it is they're actually trying to achieve.
And trying to second guess that is just impossible. You're setting yourself up for a fall. The other question we've been asked is what are our thoughts around the Commonwealth Games in Victoria saying that they're not going to proceed with the Commonwealth Games. Our understanding was that there was some promised funding from the federal government and that was withdrawn.
About half, I believe.
So from a governance viewpoint, if half your funding gets withdrawn, you can't proceed with your project. If you can't
you won't achieve your critical success outcomes. It's just one of those things. You just simply don't have the resources to make it so.
And we've seen a number of projects have to be withdrawn and not proceed because there are these potential showstoppers that can't be addressed.
But the other point is just to make a remark about Monte Carlo simulations, because we see a lot of this and people keep saying, Monte Carlo simulations have solved all your problems. No. We're not against Monte Carlo simulation because it'll tell you the most likely outcomes, and that's worth knowing. We're not in any doubt about that at all. But what Monte Carlo simulation simply can't do is pick the high consequence, low likelihood event, because it generally a rare combination of circumstances has to get together. The way I normally explain, if you've got three probability distributions you've got to add up for a Monte Carlo simulation, the only way to do that is to do a number of trials to get the final probability distribution, and you might only do 15 or 20,000 trials if you're lucky. What happens to the low likelihood long tails of each of those distributions? Well, the answer is they just go missing. So if you had a 1 in 1,000 chance for each for three probability distributions, in order to find the 1 in a billion chance where those three of those combine to cause a disaster, you'd have to do, well, at least 1 billion trials, or to be statistically significant, 10 billion trials, and nobody does that. So that means the long tail, low likelihood events that can conspire together are just ignored and thrown away. Our process doesn't do that.
I think that was my takeaway from the conference, was that there was a real want to focus on top-down criticality and vulnerability, and that was from the owner's viewpoint to deliver, because there's a lot of big projects going on in Australia at the moment.
And they're still going over budget badly.
But the tools and techniques that are being currently used by organisations to identify the key risk issues for projects is still very much bottom up and lower level, the more likely, lower consequence ones. So identify your project or potential project showstoppers first, and then the other stuff is done secondary, but you do need to do both processes.
That's correct. And you'll find that all the senior decision makers, once you hit a potential showstopper, they will not let the project proceed. They will not let the tender be let until you have shown why that will not be the case. Why it can't happen.
So this is sort of a passion subject for me in particular, but I hope you enjoyed the podcast today and that you can join us next time.